President Cyril Ramaphosa is set to address the nation tonight. He'll be sharing some of the developments in the country's risk-adjusted lockdown strategy to manage the spread of COVID-19. The president held several meetings with multiple bodies. Our senior reporter, politics reporter, that is Ziyanda Ngcobo, is tracking that story for us. She's live at the Union buildings as we wait for that address at 7 o'clock. Ziyanda, there's been no shortage of lobbying coming from practically most sectors right now. One of them being about the economy coming back online. Some of them, of course, also include some of the social issues that the country has been facing as a result of the lockdown. The question tonight is, whose voice will the president listen to? Do we know?
Well, Kathy, if the draft regulations which we've seen as Newzroom Afrika are anything to go by, there's certainly going to be disappointment and possibly legal action from the tobacco industry once again. This comes after the National Coronavirus Command Council met, and we understand that that particular meeting, when it came to that topic in particular, was quite heated, and there was rigorous debate over whether or not to lift the ban on cigarettes. Now, some within the NCCC are arguing that in terms of the capacity of the state to deal with the increase in numbers, those who continue smoking will probably need ventilators the most. And we do know, Kathy, that there is a shortage of ventilators. Just last week we got around 1,000 from the United States, and we're expecting to get more from Israel. But certainly the issue of ventilators is a problem. And of course, lockdown level 3 also has to look at, of course, the preparedness of the various provinces. We heard over a week ago when the president addressed the nation saying that it will depend on a number of factors, and of course the economic factors that have been coming from all kinds of voices within this sector have been raising the issue sharply to say for the industries that can open up with, of course, strict health precautions must do so. We've heard, of course, even when we read that leaked document, Kathy, that for an example the construction and manufacturing industry that has more than 500 employees should, for an example, provide transport, and that in fact when you go to entertainment and other recreational activities, those are likely to remain closed, for an example hotels, etc., except for those hotels, of course, that are accommodating tourists who are still stuck in South Africa. But certainly when it comes to alcohol, which is another issue, Kathy, that has been discussed about, be it on social media and everywhere else, is likely, if these regulations, the draft regulations or anything to go by, are likely to be sold at off-site areas, and of course with particular restrictions in terms of time and which days of the week.
Ziyanda, whatever the president announces tonight, it's become more apparent that the integrity of this lockdown currently rests on a level of transparency, perhaps even beyond what we've seen, for the public to know what exactly is informing government's decision-making.
Definitely, Kathy, the issue of communication, transparency and accountability remain key when it comes to, the president's word being legitimate. We, of course, remember the U-turn that came when the president announced that cigarettes would be sold from the 1st of May. And then we heard then from the Cooperative Governance Minister, Dr. Nkosazana Zuma, then actually saying that another decision had been made to actually continue with the ban. And as I've said, the logic that we understand was presented before the National Coronavirus Command Council was that it would be around, the continued ban rather would be as a result of the ability of the state to prepare for the peak of the infections, which of course we've been told by experts is expected around August, September. And as we anticipate and wait to hear from the president this evening, yes, communication is important, but also really reassuring South Africans about the preparedness of governments to deal with this virus and how they're going to ensure, of course, that citizens will be safe, because we know the virus spreads with the movements of people. And of course we'll also need to hear about whether or not interprovincial movement will be allowed. If we look at what happened when that 5-day window was given to parents to move their children around, we know that the Eastern Cape saw an increase in their numbers because of some who had traveled from the Western Cape into that particular particular province. So there are many issues that need to be delved into this evening, Kathy, and I think because of the confusion and the backtracking and the miscommunication at times, it will be very important for the president to be clear, concise, and actually take the nation into his confidence as to what the logic behind the particular regulations is and what determinations will come from that.
The political landscape has also changed considerably since the 17th of March when we saw these restrictions first imposed, because political parties are certainly not as united as they were at the onset of this lockdown. Speak to us about that meeting that the president had with political parties. How much consensus does he have for some of the, and support for some of the measures he'll be announcing tonight?
Well, I'll tell you, for an example, the Democratic Alliance and the Freedom Front Plus are the two political parties that have brought litigation, against the government, and in particular the National Coronavirus Command Council, especially when, and they are actually seeking to get clarity on the constitutionality of the National Disaster Management Act and the powers that this act actually bestows upon, Cooperative Governance Minister Dr. Ngcobo. Then you have the EFF, for an example, which will tell you that they don't even believe we should have moved from level 5 to 4, that the country needs to remain on level 5, a hard lockdown, because, the numbers continue to increase. And at this point in time, they're seeing the government actually prioritizing, profit over lives. And we understand that EFF leader Julius Malema is also one of those who are said to have backed up Dlamini Zuma when it came to her lobbying for the cigarette ban to continue. And then you get, of course, the UDM as well as the IFP, who are even saying that, when you look at the lockdown levels, everyone must return to work, and that it doesn't necessarily have to remain at level 3, but the country can actually jump straight to lockdown level 2, which of course would see an even greater easing of the regulations and would and as we've seen from what has been stipulated so far, would also include domestic air travel, interprovincial movements. And so certainly when you look at the discussions that are taking place, it seems as though, the president does have the support from political parties. They're not particularly opposed. But the main bone of contention here is that the president and the NCCC must explain the logic behind the regulations. We saw, the issue of exercise being limited between 6 and 9 a.m., raising the ire of the public, but also political parties such as the DA saying that they seem arbitrary and that they don't seem to be guided by logic. So the science and the logic behind what the president says this evening will remain topical.